The Communist Party has a plan to destroy religion, and it begins with the red market. Can religion survive in China? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party has a clever plan to destroy religion in China. It doesn't just attack religion from the outside, it also tries to subvert it from within. Sheli Джан is back with part 2 of her interview with Marko Respinti, the director in charge of Bitter Winter, who's exposing this issue.
Mr. Respinti, thank you for joining us in this park in Milan.
Thank you.
So I do have to say that a lot of the things that you report on Bitter Winter, I really haven't seen reported anywhere else. For example, last year the Chinese government passed this new regulations on religious affairs. Could you talk a little bit about that and the impact that it's had?
Yeah, the regulation was published officially in February the 1st, 2018, but it was in the air for some months before. That was a really turning point in the attitude of the CCP toward religion, because it's a very strict law that almost forbids every kind of religion public manifestation. The CCP has been convinced since years, and when I say years, it means decades, that from the Mao Zedong times on, that religion is an unnatural thing, and that naturally it will go extinct someday. But also they saw that didn't happen so fast. So they managed to help the extinction of religion. So while they still think that religion will die out naturally, sometimes they help this process. And the new regulation on religious affairs have been designed just for that, to help in a very effective way the extinction of religion. Today, the religious market or landscape can be divided into 3 main areas. According to some Chinese sociologists who studied religion in China, they can be divided into the gray market, black market, red market. The red market is what is the attempt by the CCP to tame and domesticate religion, trying to infiltrate and control them. And so this is why they created 5 so-called patriotic associations back in the 50s to control Protestant, Catholics, Taoists, Buddhists, and Muslims. And this is the red market, the official religion. Then we have the gray market, which is a kind of mixed area in which religion is not permitted, but it is tolerated at some extent, because the religious group populating this gray area are so huge, or connected to some.
What would these groups be?
For example, the Catholic Church for many time, or the Protestant non-patriotic church called the House Church. It's a huge network of Protestant churches, very difficult to control and to infiltrate. So even if they are considered enemy of the state, like every kind of religious group, they are tolerated because they cannot be repressed directly. So they are expecting them to die out, helping them, but tolerating them at some extent. And then we have the third area, the black market, where the groups belonging to this area are called xiejiao, meaning unorthodox, heterodox, heterodox teaching. It's an old expression used by the Chinese power back in the old days, which has been resurrected by the CCP to mean cults. So this is a label through which they condemn these groups like criminals, and just belonging to one of these groups is one of the most awful crime that you can do in China. So these people belonging to the black market are persecuted directly. The other groups are infiltrated, controlled, but this is not because the CCP is good toward them, but because it doesn't have enough power yet to repress directly all of them. So it tries to infiltrate and to control them in an indirect way.
So the black market would be like which groups?
Like Falun Gong, for example, who has been exterminated literally in huge numbers. The Church of the Almighty God, which is noteworthy because it's the youngest new religious group in China and the one who is growing at a faster pace. So it's very huge and it's persecuted for them. It has been called the new Falun Gong, not because of theology, they have a completely different theology, but because of the persecution they're suffering. Or groups like the Shouters, who are a new religious movement coming out of the Protestant universe, so to speak. So many groups who are considered cults. Which, by the way, it's an expression that scholars don't use because it's a way of labeling or giving names to your opponent, and it's not very scholarly to use that. So the CCP is condemning directly these people and it's persecuting directly these people. To the grey market, so the middle of the road place. One thing which is not worthy to say is that they try, as I said, to control, infiltrate them because they don't have the power to repress them directly, or because they have connection internationally. For example, the Catholic Church. One thing is to say the Catholic Church is my enemy, and the CCP is not using anymore that language. And another thing is trying to repress that. How can you repress a thing like the Vatican, the Catholic Church, which is all over the world, powerful at some extent? So it's not a matter sometimes of the size of the group, but the connection they have. For example, the Falun Gong, when it was persecuted in the first time, it didn't have so much connection abroad, so it was a kind of internal affair for China. And the Church of the Almighty God, it's another persecuted group who had no connection before they escaped China, or the connection they have now is not so strong, huge, and recognized publicly as the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church. So it's easier for the CCP to go and repress them in the dark.
Yes, and like you said, to use 邪教, which does not mean cult in Chinese, but to translate that as cult and use that label on these groups.
Yeah.
Where would Tibetan Buddhists and like Uyghur Muslims or Kazakh Muslims fall in this hierarchy?
Yeah, this is a good question, because officially Islam could at some extent belong to the first area, the red market, because there is the Chinese, the Islamic Chinese Association, which is the patriotic trying of controlling them. So if you Muslim belong or comply to that association, you're tolerated officially. But if you don't, you are persecuted. But to what group do you belong? I would say the middle of the road, because they cannot define, even if some try to define even Christianity as a cult, they cannot define Islam as a cult. So Islam will not belong to the black market. It would belong to the gray market, theoretically. But you understand that these divisions are very important for scholars to try to figure the situation out. But on the ground, the boundaries between these groups can easily be overlapped and become, depending on some official, they can be completely ignored. As a matter of fact, in Xinjiang, Islam is persecuted as such. Uyghurs who are Muslim are persecuted because they are non-Chinese, non-Han Chinese, because they belong to a different minority. And some people would think that this belongs to some political and not religious reason, but this is not true, because alongside the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, all the Turkic people and Muslim people are persecuted. Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tatars, and all these people. So they are persecuted because they are minorities and Muslim. But again, we have some Muslims who are not, who don't belong to, who are not part of any ethnic group, like the Hui Muslim. They are Han Chinese, being Muslim, and they were once the good Muslim, this is the words of the CCP, against the bad Muslim in Xinjiang. But we know, and we have reported so much about the persecution that the CCP is waging against them today. And they are not belonging to any ethnic minority. So it's a war against Islam, because it's a war against religion. The same happens to the Tibetan Buddhists. Tibetan Buddhists, officially, again, Buddhism cannot be labeled as a cult, but we know that it's strictly forbidden, especially in Tibet, where there is also a political problem, a very old political problem, and we don't deal with that as bitter winter, but we know that. So Tibetan Buddhism is repressed as such. So practically, you could look at Tibetan Buddhism as belonging to the black market. Maybe the scholars will react to this word because it's not technically true, but practically all of them are segregated, all of them are denied in their rights, religions and human rights. So this is the situation.
Are there a lot of religious believers in China?
Yes. I remember some studies dating back to some 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, something called God in the party. Not meaning the fist, but meaning, the CCP, meaning that there is an increasing religious attention, at least, also within the party. We know for sure, and some scholars have studied the unwanted effect of the Tiananmen massacre exactly 30 years ago. And this is in two levels. First of all, the CCP at that time, 30 years ago, was convinced that what was happening in Soviet Russia and in the East, meaning the crumbling of the Soviet Empire and then communism, they thought that it was the effect of some religious groups. And so they studied carefully what was happening there in order to avoid that happening in China. And the Tiananmen massacre can be also, not only, but also explained in the way of repressing potential enemies doing in China what they did in Europe, and that potential enemies are religious groups. Scholars have studied that. They are not convinced that the CCP was right, saying that religious groups were effective in destroying the Soviet empire. They had a role, but there was also something else, a political, economic reason. But the CCP has been convinced since then, that time, that that was the truth. This explains why religion became the first enemy of the CCP, because they see the potential in the religious group of destroying China, just like they think that religious group destroyed Soviet Russia. What brought them to this understanding, and the understanding regarding China specifically, is that before, 30 years ago, before the Tiananmen massacre, people got disillusioned by the ideology and they started turning to religion. We saw the growing of important new religious movement, and also mainline religions having new believers. And some of them, many of them, I will not say most, but many of them belong also to the party. And the growing, after the Tiananmen massacre, the growing of some new religious movement like the Falun Gong and other, but also Christianity, mainline Christianity and Buddhism and Islam, can be explained saying that in face of the massacre, of that massacre, people got even more disillusioned by communism, and this affect also some official within the CCP.
So what you're saying is that the CCP's fear of religious, organizations, or that they could somehow present an ideological challenge to the CCP goes back 30 years.
Yes.
But from what you were saying about the religious affairs regulations, it could seem like, the CCP's repression of religions is very new.
Well, if we study history, we see that religions has always been persecuted as such. Of course, there are up and downs, and this belong, of course, to different personality of the leaders of the CCP, but also depends on the strength that they have. As I said, I think that Xi Jinping now has or think to have the strength to go back to the old days of direct persecution. And I also see that Xi Jinping thinks of himself as a kind of new Mao Zedong, and I explain why. Even if there are differences, huge differences in terms of history, circumstances, and ideology also, he made himself president for life. He inserted his own thinking within the constitution, just like Mao Zedong did. He thinks of himself as being, the real leader of the church, maybe the new God. I'm not making it up. We know, and we published the attempt of some CCP official to go into churches, mosques, and even families to tearing down religious pictures of Jesus, of Buddhist signs, Islamic signs, substituting them with two portraits, Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping, and then going back to the families 1 week later to check out if they were praying actually to those two portraits. So even if it's a secular atheistic ideology, communism and the CCP know how much important is religion for the people, so they are trying to substitute themselves to God because they fear God, or they fear religious people. Yes, there is an increase in direct persecution from last year on, but up and downs notwithstanding, persecution has been around always, in different ways. And again, this depends on the strength, it depends also on the context. China today is in the news. It has many ties politically and economically with many nations. I think that is my opinion. I think that Xi Jinping and his officials think that people will not pay too much attention to human rights if they do something wrong because they have other interests, economic and political. So I think this is the right moment for them to repress directly religion. Maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they were not, the CCP, were not in the position to do that. But the cast of mind of thinking that religion is unnatural and that it will naturally die out have never abandoned the CCP.
One thing that I noticed from Bitter Winter's reporting is it seems like a lot of the things that the Chinese Communist Party is doing to repress religion affect all Chinese people, not just religious believers. Things like having the turning churches or religious buildings into these what are they called? The civil like leadership, or it was civilization practice centers.
Yeah, civilization practice center to cynicize religions and groups.
So to kind of replace that with kind of Communist Party ideology, where instead of going to church on Sunday, now everybody in the village has to come and do something else, listen to operas that talk about the CCP or something. But or the district people who have to kind of monitor everybody, and know whether people in their neighborhood are practicing religions or other things about this. So, is this something that is spreading to even people who are not active religious believers?
I strongly think so, and this is in the facts. Because, attacking and destroying religious group or religion as such don't affect only religious people. For good or for bad, if we like it or not, believers or not, religion is part of the cultural landscape of humankind. It has been around since forever. And it will never die out, even if the CCP thinks differently. We, in fact, see a spreading of a new spring for religion, many groups, many new groups, many different persuasion, many faiths, many creeds. So it's part of the world. To think that you can eliminate completely religion from human culture, human civilization, it's a crazy thing to do. If you eliminate religion in many groups and peoples, you will not have art, music, whatever. So even if you're not a believer, if you're not a church goer, if you don't go to the mosque, if you don't practice religion, religion comes to you in terms of culture, music, art, literature, whatever you want, you name it. It's not possible to separate one or the other. So if you attack religion, you will end up in attacking normal people, also non-believers. And this is one thing. The second thing is that in order to repress religion, the CCP is establishing a way of controlling society in every little corner. There are facial recognition machines. There are people who want to go abroad and have a passport must pass through some questions. If you enroll in a university, they will ask you if you are a believer and if you're parents. So there is a control on the life of the people. And so I can imagine one non-believer being annoyed by seeing his son going to the university and being questioned if he's a believer or not. And this is a violation of human rights and freedom. And thirdly, China is becoming a very repressive, or is already a very repressive society. Some people say that regarding Xinjiang, for example, yes, we know the tragedy of the camps. But some scholars who visited Xinjiang says, okay, we have the camps, but the Xinjiang as such is becoming an open-air, huge detention camp, meaning that people are repressing their own fundamental freedoms and liberties. So yes, attacking religion is affecting also non-believers. This is bad for the whole society.
What would you say that Bitter Winter has been reporting that's not getting enough attention in the international media?
Well, unfortunately, many of the things that we publish don't get enough attention. Uyghurs, we deal a lot with Uyghurs, and they are in the news at some extent because the U.S. Congress passed laws, bills, and there is much attention in the U.S. on Uyghurs. Also because the Uyghurs are lobbying very well in the U.S. But there is much more than that. I mean, there are many more countries in the world, and there are many more problems in China that don't get the same attention. Out of many, I just mentioned one, and the problem is refugees. The persecution in China gets many Chinese to escape. They come to the West, they go to many countries. They have the problem of being accepted as full citizens. There is a lot of rhetoric these days on immigration. I don't justify all that rhetoric, but I understand when people saying that sometimes immigration can cause problems. But one thing is to send lawfully back some unlawful immigrants because of economic reason. it's a bad thing if he is poor, but we need to cope with that. But a totally different thing is to get back on the spot some Chinese exiles who has been persecuted for his religious or her religious faith, and these people get arrested, detained, tortured, and even killed right away. So we have a responsibility toward those people, and if we don't cope with that, we will be, in some extent, aiding the CCP in its crimes.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's China Uncensored. Be sure to check out part 1 of this interview, which we published last week. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.